How would you define high fantasy?
The stuff that takes itself very seriously.
I was going to say, Heather, how much time do you have? How much time do you have?
Colin,
Because we could make this
I
a
have
7-part
all the
series.
time in the world to talk about this.
For me personally, high fantasy takes place in a world completely divorced from our own. So Harry Potter doesn't count. The Narnia books don't necessarily count. High fantasy also has an element of magic plays a major plot point. So something like I'm even trying to think of a good example.
Dragon Riders of Pern?
Yeah, that's more science fiction to me because it's never magic. There's alien beasts that are very similar to
Never actually read them.
Yeah.
They're
yeah.
so good.
See, I don't really like high fantasy though.
Boo. Nah, I get it.
I mean, if it could have a sense of humor about itself, I just feel like a lot of it is up its own butt. I enjoy Game of Thrones. I don't know if that is considered necessarily high fantasy, but
Yep.
I
absolutely is.
enjoyed the way it was written. It was interesting and kept my attention, even though it was insanely long. Like, I would have read the entire series if the author didn't piss me off. So.
Or finish the series. He's still 2 books shy of completing it, and it's been, I think, 10 years since he put out the last book.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
See, I get exactly what you're saying, but I love it personally. Like, I cannot get enough of high fantasy and D&D kind of stuff. You said you read the Discworld books, right, Hilary?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Nice.
I love them.
Yep. That's a perfect example of a high fantasy that is funny and takes itself like it's serious, but it's not. Like, it's the perfect blend of that high fantasy and comedy, and just, I don't know, it's great. Now, you don't think it's high fantasy, Discworld?
I think it's he used Discworld as a reflection of our world, and he told it in a way that was relatable and funny, but he talked about things that like actually matter. So I don't know. That's what I got out of the Discworld series. I didn't necessarily categorize it as high fantasy. Maybe I'd have to think about it.
Honestly, it could go either way, and that's like when we did our genre discussion. It's like there's so many things that could fall into multiple categories. Like, if you want to define high fantasy as different than comedic fantasy, it fits in there.
Right.
If you want to define high fantasy and comedic fantasy as different than like allegorical fantasy, you can, there's so many different ways you could swing it depending on what your definition is. So, yeah.
And I think
to me, go on, Heather.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, for my definition of high fantasy, it fits. It's a world that's like, it's not our world, even if the problems he's kind of spotlighting are problems we face in the real world, and the way we go about things and the ridiculousness of our society at times. It's still like, there's magic. There's nobody comes from our Earth, or I haven't read all of them. So if somebody does, that's not like the focus of the book like Harry Potter is, So for me, yeah, I say high fantasy.
I feel like Discworld is accessible in a way that is maybe not other high fantasies aren't as accessible
Sure.
to more people.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah, and I'm kind of in the middle because I think my go-to example of high fantasy is Tolkien. And
Sure.
in the Lord of the Rings, like that was, I mean, it's been a while since I've read it, but that was ridiculously serious. Like there were no jokes. And in the movies, like they made, which one of the, was it Merry or Pippin, they made the comic relief. Like I don't
Yeah.
remember him being the comic relief in the book. Like they did have that thing where like they were sitting on a battlefield smoking their pipes, but that's like completely in character for hobbits. Like that wasn't something clever or goofy or anything. It was just who they were. So, and I wonder, like, when you, Colin, you were saying, like, the difference between high fantasy and comedic fantasy. It seems like a lot of the time, at least the comedic fantasy that I have read, is spoofing on or making fun of high fantasy. So it's like those established tropes, and then it's like, yeah, like you're saying, Hill, like it's so up its own butt. Like some of the things that really annoy me about high fantasy, and I can't think of any. It might have been the David Edding. I read one of the David Eddings series like a really long time ago, but it's like the books that they throw you headfirst into the world in a way that just expects you to understand everything that's going on.
Yep.
And like there are ways of doing that, of immersing you in the world without holding your hand and giving you exposition dumps every 5 sentences. But it seems like so much with at least the random high fantasy books that I would consider high fantasy that I find like at used bookstores and stuff. It's so much like you open the first page and on the 7th day of Galadriel and this year of our Lord.
Yeah.
And it's like part of me really likes that, and part of me is like, oh my god, are you kidding me? So it's, I kind of find that element of high fantasy funny. Like they're not trying to be funny.
Yeah.
But I find it amusing.
Well, that's what I like. That's why I don't really consider. Why I wouldn't necessarily consider Discworld high fantasy, because I feel like high fantasy, and maybe, I guess he kind of alluded to languages, but like high fantasy, they created their own language for their books, and they like make up words for different things in that world, and I mean, I guess he kind of did that, but everything that he did connected to something in our world that was relatable. And I guess I guess you like he never like invented I don't know. He based everything off of something. It was not necessarily like a complete invention of something else. That's
sure. I could see that. And, you know, I fully admit straight up, my definition is ultra broad.
Not to say he wasn't a genius or anything, because he was.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think I hadn't taken into account the world or the like the connection between our world and or lack thereof of like the high fantasy world, because I think my definition of high fantasy is like a fantasy story that takes itself a little bit too seriously. Magic plays a big role. There's all different kinds of races or, you know, different beings. Like it's really hard to have high fantasy where you only have like humans, or you only have elves, or you only have dwarves. It's like high fantasy, you need all of them. And usually, in for me anyway, usually there's some kind of epic quest involved.
Yeah.
That could just be like the Tolkien influence, but it does seem like that. And maybe it's also like a D&D influence, I don't know, or like the two feeding into each other, because it really seems, well, at least in my mind, like high fantasy needs to involve, there's some thing that our heroes either need to get or achieve or overcome. And yeah, I hadn't really thought about the difference between, like, it has to be set in some kind of fantasy realm. It doesn't have a connection to our own world.
Yeah. Now, I will say this. Like I said, my definition of high fantasy is like, I almost consider it more like the umbrella term. It's super broad. But like what you were describing with like the epic quests and Lord of the Rings, a lot of people put that into epic fantasy. And then there's also high fantasy and low fantasy and such like that. Like Conan would be low fantasy, as it were. Or no, Conan is sword and sorcery. I'm sorry. But like low fantasy is like you might have, it might be a fantastical world, but everything's more grounded in like more of a reality, as it were. There's not like dragons and wizards, or if they are, it's like there's one dragon, he lives in the North Pole. It doesn't really do much to the story. You know, we're telling a story about these two kingdoms warring with each other, like via conventional means. So
interesting.
You know, but yeah, you could go any which way you want with them. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking, would you consider stories about like King Arthur, like fictional stories about King Arthur, to be high fantasy or low fantasy?
Are you asking me? For me, I think it depends on the tone of the story. If it's like, yeah, well, I guess all stories are fictional about King Arthur, but are you making the differentiation between like, this is a telling of an old myth from like centuries ago versus like, I'm just going to write a story about King Arthur and he's going to do battle with gremlins or some crazy shit like that.
Yeah. Like trying to separate the myth from like, I guess, more modern myth. I don't know, because I'm thinking like the Mists of Avalon. And then there was this book I found a long time ago. I think it's called like King Arthur's Daughter or something like that. And I don't remember how they finagle that. I don't remember whose mother, who was her mother, but it was like in sort of it's these fictionalizations of the story of King Arthur, which in itself is already fictionalized. I mean, separating from any type of historical figure that may be Arthur, or multiple figures that became the story of King Arthur, separate from that, people's fictionalizations and fantasizations of the story of King Arthur. Would you consider that high fantasy?
Probably. I think it depends on the tone of it. I think if it's just like, if it's like King Arthur and his knights are, you know, like they're going to the tourney and, oh, they're going to win this fair maiden's hand. Like that might be more of like a, you call that courtly romance or something. But if it's like King Arthur and his men are off to slay this dragon that lives in the hills, and oh, Merlin's coming along and casting fireballs, like, that says more high fantasy to me, you know? So, I don't know. Definitions are hard and weird.
But I love talking about them.
Yeah. Definitely. Now I want to read King Arthur stuff.
Yeah.
Who am I? There's too much on my to-read pile. God damn it. Did you ever have an existential crisis, H squared, where like you look at your to read pile or your to watch pile or your to do pile, and then you measure the probable expected like outcome of the rest of your life, like how many years and days and minutes and hours and seconds you have, and you have this existential crisis knowing you can never get to do all of this stuff?
Oh only about every other day.
No, not you, Hilary.
No, I'll get to it.
Man, I wish I had that kind of optimism. That's
All
awesome.
right.
That's incredible. I did this Proust questionnaire where it's like 35 questions to get to the soul of a person, and one of them was like, how do you wish to die? And I was like, I don't, like, let's keep this party going, everybody, you know, like if I live a million years, I will probably not get through all of my Amazon Prime watch list, but that would be a good start. I'd make a good dent in it. So let's just keep this gravy train rolling.
Because now it's got me thinking about all these books, and like I don't even know what like any type of official definition of high fantasy is. You know, to even start and be like, oh, okay, that's how Google defines high fantasy, or that's how the organization of high fantasy defines high fantasy.
Here, from one guy's article, the primary difference between high fantasy and low fantasy is the setting. In high fantasy, the story takes place in a secondary fictional setting that is utterly independent of the real world. In low fantasy, the story takes place in a familiar real world setting. That's just this one guy's
Interesting.
thing that he has said. It is difficult to commit to a concrete definition of high fantasy without feeling dissatisfied that you've either been too specific and excluded important works or been too vague, which would include a lot of novels clearly not high fantasy. Agreed.
Yes.
It seems best to apply the old axiom of I know it when I see it. Agreed. According to this guy's, at least, generally high fantasy has an imaginary world, usually an entirely imaginary world, but can be a parallel world or a world within our world. A battle of good versus evil or other epic theme. Multi-volumed works with a complicated plot. I don't know if I'd agree to that, but you know.
I think more
magic,
often than not, yeah. But yeah.
Magic, non-human races, and medieval technology. So, yeah.
I could agree to that.
Yeah. I want to talk about fantasy all day, but we should probably record our podcast.
Okay.